the Black Knight satellite. In 1960, at the height of the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union were tracking each other's satellites obsessively. Each side knew exactly what the other had launched and where it was orbiting. Then radar operators at the U.S. Navy's Dark Fence Detection System picked up something that shouldn't exist. An object was in polar orbit around Earth, unusual because most satellites at that time used equatorial orbits. The object was large, estimated at over 10 tons, far heavier than anything either superpower had launched. Most disturbingly, neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union claimed it. The Pentagon quietly investigated, assuming it must be a secret Soviet satellite. But inquiries through intelligence channels suggested the Soviets were equally puzzled and suspected it was American. Neither side would publicly acknowledge the object, because doing so would reveal the extent of their tracking capabilities. The object became known as the Black Knight satellite among those tracking it. Time magazine even ran a brief article in 1960 about the mysterious object in polar orbit, though details were scarce due to military classification. What made the Black Knight particularly strange was its orbit. At a time when satellites were struggling to achieve stable orbits and frequently fell back to Earth after weeks or months, this object maintained a stable polar orbit. It was in a higher orbit than most satellites of that era, suggesting advanced propulsion or orbital mechanics. The object was tracked intermittently throughout the 1960s. Reports from radar operators described it as tumbling or rotating in ways that didn't match typical satellite behavior. Some operators reported that it seemed to change velocity slightly, accelerating or decelerating in ways that space debris shouldn't. In 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper reported seeing a glowing green object approaching his Mercury capsule during his final orbit. Ground control told him it was probably an optical illusion from cabin pressure changes. But radar stations in Australia reportedly tracked an unknown object near Cooper's position at that exact time. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, amateur astronomers and satellite trackers continued reporting observations of an unidentified object in polar orbit. The object appeared in catalogs under various designations, but was never officially explained. In 1998, during Space Shuttle mission STS-88, astronauts photographed an object floating near the shuttle that resembled a dark, irregular satellite. NASA identified it as a thermal blanket that had come loose during a spacewalk. But some researchers pointed out that the object in the photos looked nothing like a thermal blanket and appeared far too large. Skeptics argue that Black Knight is actually multiple different objects, and sightings conflated into one legend. They suggest it's a combination of misidentified space debris, thermal blankets, and normal satellites that were simply not publicly disclosed during the Cold War. However, declassified documents from the early 1960s confirm that U.S. radar did detect an unidentified object in polar orbit that neither superpower claimed. The object was real, tracked by multiple stations, and its origin was genuinely unknown at the time. Whether it was a secret military satellite neither side would acknowledge, debris from an undisclosed launch, or something else entirely, an object was in polar orbit in 1960 that shouldn't have been there. Some satellite trackers claim a similar object is still in orbit today, though its exact identity and origin remain disputed. 1991 VG, the Near-Earth Object. On November 6, 1991, astronomer James Scotty at the University of Arizona's Spacewatch program discovered an object designated 1991 VG. It was classified as a near-Earth asteroid, but almost immediately its characteristics raised questions. 1991, VG's orbit was strangely similar to Earth's, so similar that it suggested possible artificial origin. Its orbital period, eccentricity, and inclination were nearly identical to Earth's, which is statistically unusual for a natural asteroid. Most asteroids have highly elliptical orbits very different from Earth's near-circular path. More unusual was 1991 VG's brightness variations. As astronomers tracked it, the object's brightness changed dramatically and regularly, suggesting it was tumbling or rotating. The pattern of brightness changes was consistent with a cylindrical or irregular object, reflecting sunlight as it rotated, similar to how a spent rocket stage might appear. Calculations of its orbit showed that 1991 VG had made a close approach to Earth in 1975 and would do so again in 2017. The object's trajectory suggested it might have originated from Earth or been captured by Earth's gravity at some point. Some researchers proposed that 1991 VG might be a piece of Apollo-era hardware, perhaps a rocket stage or satellite that had been in an unusual orbit for decades and was only discovered in 1991. But checks of all known Apollo hardware and satellites from that era showed nothing that matched 1991 VG's orbital characteristics. The object's size was estimated at 5 to 10 meters, consistent with a rocket stage or small satellite. But its spectral signature, the colors of light it reflected, didn't match typical rocket materials. It also didn't match the spectral signature of known asteroid compositions. In 1992, physicist Duncan Steele published a paper suggesting 1991 VG might be of artificial origin, possibly a returning spacecraft or probe. He noted that its Earth-like orbit and close approaches were more consistent with human-made objects than natural asteroids. As 1991 VG moved away from Earth after its 1991 approach, it became too faint to track with available telescopes. It essentially disappeared from observation. Attempts to relocate it in subsequent years failed. The object was predicted to make another close approach to Earth in December 2017. Astronomers prepared to observe it, hoping to finally determine its nature. But when the time came, 1991 VG was not where calculations predicted it should be. Either the orbit calculations were off, or something had changed its trajectory. To this day, 1991 VG's nature remains unknown. Is it a natural asteroid that happens to have an Earth-like orbit through cosmic coincidence? Is it a piece of space hardware from an undisclosed launch? Or is it something else that mimics both artificial and natural characteristics? The object appears in official catalogs as a near-Earth object of uncertain origin. It's one of several objects whose classification wavers between probably artificial and probably natural without definitive proof either way. J0002E3, the Mystery Apollo Stage. In September 2002, amateur astronomer Bill Young discovered a small object in orbit around Earth. Designated J0002E3, the object was unusual because it hadn't been there before, at least not in recent memory. It appeared to have been captured by Earth's gravity recently, entering an irregular orbit. When professional astronomers examined J0002E3, they immediately noticed strange characteristics. Its brightness variations suggested it was tumbling or rotating. Its spectral signature, the way it reflected light, matched titanium dioxide, a compound used in white paint on spacecraft, particularly the Apollo Saturn V rockets. This suggested J0002E3 might be the SIVB third stage from one of the Apollo missions. The SIVB stages were supposed to have been sent into solar orbit or crashed into the moon after their missions, but perhaps one had been in solar orbit and recently been recaptured by Earth's gravity. Researchers tried to match J0002E3's orbit to known Apollo missions. The closest match was Apollo 12, launched in November 1969. The timing, orbital characteristics, and spectral signature all suggested J0002E3 might be the Apollo 12 SIVB stage. But there was a problem. NASA's records clearly stated that the Apollo 12 SIVB had crashed into the moon on November 20th, 1969, as intended. Seismometers left on the lunar surface by Apollo 11 had even recorded the impact, which caused the moon to ring for over an hour. If the Apollo 12 SIVB had hit the moon in 1969, then what was J0002E3? Was it the SIVB from a different Apollo mission whose disposal had been misrecorded? Or was it something else entirely that just happened to have paint-matching Apollo-era spacecraft? Researchers checked records of all Apollo missions. Every SIVB stage was accounted for, either crashed into the moon, sent into solar orbit, or in the case of the Apollo 13 stage, verified to have burned up in Earth's atmosphere in 1970. None were missing. Some suggested J0002E3 might be from a Saturn V test flight or an unrecorded mission. But all Saturn V launches are extensively documented, and no SIVB stages are unaccounted for in official records. In 2003, J002E3's orbit became unstable, and it escaped Earth's gravity, returning to solar orbit. Before it left, astronomers took detailed measurements. The spectral data strongly suggested Apollo-era spacecraft materials, but the object's exact identity could not be confirmed. J002E3 is predicted to be recaptured by Earth's gravity again around 2032. When it returns, astronomers hope to gather enough data to definitively identify it. Until then, it remains an object that appears to be a piece of Apollo hardware, but doesn't match any known missing piece. The case raises an uncomfortable question. Are space agencies' records of what they have launched and where it ended up as complete as we believe? Or are there objects in orbit that were launched but never properly cataloged, or whose disposal was misrecorded? The PSSC-2 Mystery. In 1969, the United States launched a classified military satellite designated OPS-3180, also known as PSSC-2. It was a surveillance satellite, part of the Pentagon's classified Program 661A, designed to monitor Soviet missile tests. The satellite was launched into a highly elliptical orbit that would take it over Soviet territory at specific intervals. What makes PSSC-2 mysterious isn't its launch. That's well documented. But what happened to it? According to official records, the satellite functioned normally for several years, then was deactivated in the mid-1970s. It should have remained in orbit as inactive space debris, gradually decaying and eventually re-entering Earth's atmosphere. But satellite trackers noticed something strange in the 1990s. PSSC-2, which should have been inert, appeared to be maneuvering. Its orbit changed in ways inconsistent with natural orbital decay. The changes were subtle but detectable, small adjustments that suggested active propulsion or control. This was peculiar because PSSC-2 had supposedly been inactive for over 15 years. Its fuel should have been exhausted. Its systems should have been dead. Yet tracking data showed its orbit changing in ways that couldn't be explained by atmospheric drag or gravitational perturbations alone. The U.S. military wouldn't comment on PSSC-2's status. Amateur satellite trackers repeatedly requested information about the satellite through Freedom of Information Act requests, but responses were vague or heavily redacted. In 2001, PSSC-2's orbit changed more dramatically. The satellite moved from its original elliptical orbit into a different orbit entirely. This couldn't be explained by natural forces. Something had actively changed its trajectory. Some researchers suggested that PSSC-2 had never actually been deactivated, that it had continued operating in secret for decades beyond its official retirement. Perhaps it had been repurposed for a different classified mission, and the deactivation was a cover story. Others proposed that a different satellite had been launched and given PSSC-2's designation to hide the new launch. By reusing the catalog number of an old inactive satellite, a new launch could be hidden in plain sight among the debris tracking data. A third theory suggested that PSSC-2 had been reactivated remotely for specific missions, then returned to apparent inactivity. Modern satellites can remain dormant for years and be reactivated if needed, but this capability didn't supposedly exist in 1960s-era satellites. What's undeniable is that tracking data shows a satellite cataloged as PSSC-2 changing orbits in ways that require active propulsion, decades after the satellite was supposedly deactivated. Either PSSC-2 is still operational in some capacity, or something else is using its designation. The satellite remains in orbit today, still occasionally exhibiting orbital changes that suggest active control. Its true status and purpose remain classified. SJ-17, the Chinese satellite that moves others. In 2016, satellite trackers noticed something unprecedented. A Chinese satellite designated Shijian-17, SJ-17, launched in November 2016 as a communications satellite, was approaching other satellites in geostationary orbit and physically interacting with them. Geostationary orbit, located about 36,000 kilometers above Earth's equator, is where communication satellites maintain fixed positions relative to the ground. Satellites in this orbit are typically spaced apart and don't approach each other. SJ-17 was different. In June 2016, SJ-17 approached a dead Chinese satellite designated ChinaSat-20, which had been defunct for years. SJ-17 maneuvered alongside ChinaSat-20, appeared to make physical contact or come within meters of it, then moved away. After SJ-17's visit, ChinaSat-20 was in a different orbit. This was remarkable because it suggested SJ-17 had the capability to interact with other satellites, potentially moving them, capturing them, or manipulating them in some way. The technology and precision required for such an operation in geostationary orbit is extraordinary. SJ-17 then approached other satellites. It visited dead satellites and examined them, sometimes appearing to touch them or attach to them briefly. In each case, the target satellite's orbit changed after SJ-17's visit. Western space agencies watched with concern. A satellite that can approach and manipulate other satellites could theoretically disable or destroy them. It could be used for clearing space debris, rescuing malfunctioning satellites, or as an anti-satellite weapon. China stated that SJ-17 was testing space debris mitigation technologies, essentially practicing how to move dead satellites out of valuable orbital slots. But the satellite's capabilities raised security concerns, because the same technology could be used to interfere with active foreign satellites. What made SJ-17 even more mysterious was that its exact capabilities and operations were not disclosed. Satellite trackers could see it approaching other objects and see those objects' orbits change afterward, but they couldn't see exactly what SJ-17 was doing during these encounters. In 2019, SJ-17 approached a position near several U.S. military satellites. It didn't make contact, but it demonstrated that it could reach them if desired. The U.S. Space Force issued a statement expressing concern about close approaches by Chinese satellites with unclear intent. SJ-17 remains in geostationary orbit today, occasionally moving to different positions and approaching other satellites. Its exact configuration, whether it has a robotic arm, harpoon, net, or other capture mechanism, is unknown from external observation. The existence of SJ-17 and similar satellites from other nations raises a disturbing reality. There are objects in orbit with the capability to approach and manipulate other satellites, and we don't fully know what they're doing during these encounters. The Westford Needles. In 1963, the U.S. military launched Project Westford, also called Westford Needles, one of the strangest satellites ever deployed. The project involved launching 480 million tiny copper needles into orbit to create an artificial radio-reflective belt around Earth for military communications. The idea was that these millions of tiny needles, each 1.78 centimeters long and thinner than a human hair, would disperse into a belt around Earth. Radio signals could bounce off this artificial ionosphere, providing reliable military communications, even if the natural ionosphere was disrupted by nuclear explosions. 2 launches occurred, one in 1961 that failed when the needles clumped together and didn't disperse, and one in 1963 that succeeded. The 1963 launch placed 480 million copper needles into orbit at an altitude of about 3,700 kilometers. The project was controversial. Astronomers protested that the needles would interfere with radio astronomy. Scientists worried about the long-term effects of artificial objects in orbit. The Soviet Union condemned it as space pollution. The U.S. military assured everyone that the needles would naturally deorbit within 3 years due to solar wind pressure. The tiny needles, they said, would be pushed gradually by sunlight and would re-enter the atmosphere by 1966. But that's not what happened. While many needles did deorbit, many remained in space. Decades later, clumps of Westford Needles are still in orbit. Tracking networks still detect them, and they occasionally appear on collision warning systems as potential threats to spacecraft. What makes the Westford Needles mysterious today is that we don't know exactly how many are still up there or where they all are. The needles are too small to track individually. We can only detect clumps of them, which appear as small debris clouds. Satellite operators occasionally report unidentified radar returns in the altitude range where Westford Needles were deployed. These returns don't match known satellites or debris, but they're consistent with clusters of small metallic objects. Some researchers have suggested that the Westford Needles might still be reflecting radio signals, decades after the project ended. Radio astronomers occasionally detect strange interference from specific regions of space that might be explained by needle clusters. More disturbing is the realization that 480 million objects were deliberately placed in orbit with incomplete understanding of their long-term behavior. If the needles clump together in certain ways, they could create debris hazards that will persist for decades or centuries. The Westford Needles represent a category of orbital mystery. Objects we know we launched, know approximately where they are, but can't track or predict with precision. They're up there, circling Earth, potentially affecting radio transmissions and posing collision risks. But we've lost detailed knowledge of their distribution. USA-276, the Stealthy satellite. In December 2019, the United States launched a classified satellite designated USA-276 from Cape Canaveral. The launch itself was acknowledged. It was too large to hide, but details about the satellite's purpose, capabilities, and orbit were not disclosed. What made USA-276 immediately interesting to satellite trackers was its orbit. Instead of going to a typical military satellite orbit, USA-276 entered a highly elliptical orbit that would take it from low Earth orbit out to geostationary altitude and back, allowing it to survey satellites in geostationary orbit up close. Amateur satellite trackers around the world quickly found USA-276 in its orbit and began monitoring it. What they observed was disturbing. USA-276 was maneuvering constantly, changing its orbit in ways that made it difficult to predict where it would be next. This wasn't typical satellite behavior. Most satellites maintain relatively stable orbits with only occasional small adjustments. USA-276 was executing frequent large maneuvers, changing altitude, inclination, and speed in patterns that suggested it was designed to evade tracking. More concerning was what USA-276 was doing. Trackers observed it approaching geostationary satellites, both American and foreign, making close approaches, then moving away. It appeared to be conducting close-up inspections of satellites in geostationary orbit. The purpose of these inspections is classified, but the capability is clear. USA-276 can reach any satellite in geostationary orbit, approach it closely, observe it with sensors or cameras, and presumably gather intelligence about its configuration and capabilities. In 2020, USA-276 approached several Russian and Chinese military satellites in geostationary orbit. Russia's space agency issued a statement calling the approaches dangerous and provocative. China lodged a formal complaint with the United Nations about USA-276's activities, the U.S. Space Force wouldn't comment on USA-276's operations, saying only that it was conducting national security missions. But the satellite's behavior spoke for itself. It was an inspector satellite designed to examine other satellites up close. What makes USA-276 mysterious isn't just what it does, it's how stealthy it is. The satellite's maneuvering patterns make it difficult to track. Its orbit changes frequently enough that predicting its future position is challenging, and its true capabilities, what sensors or instruments it carries, are unknown. Satellite trackers have noted that USA-276 sometimes disappears from observation for days or weeks, either because it's moved to an unexpected orbit or because it's employing some form of stealth technology to reduce its radar or optical signature. USA-276 remains operational in 2024, still conducting whatever classified missions it was designed for. It represents a new era of satellite operations where spacecraft can actively maneuver, approach other satellites, and conduct operations that previous generations of satellites couldn't perform. Kosmos, 2542 and 2543, the nesting dolls. In November 2019, Russia launched a satellite designated Kosmos 2542 into low Earth orbit. According to official announcements, it was an inspector satellite designed to examine other Russian satellites and perform maintenance or debris removal operations. But Kosmos 2542 quickly revealed unusual capabilities. Within weeks of reaching orbit, it released a smaller satellite, designated Kosmos 2543. This smaller satellite then maneuvered independently, separating from its parent and entering its own orbit. This was unexpected. While satellites releasing smaller sub-satellites isn't unprecedented, Kosmos 2543 wasn't announced beforehand and wasn't a typical deployment. It appeared to be a satellite specifically designed to hide inside another satellite and be released at a chosen time. What happened next was more concerning. Kosmos 2543, the smaller satellite, began approaching a U.S. military reconnaissance satellite designated USA-245. Over several months, Kosmos 2543 maneuvered closer and closer to USA-245, eventually coming within 200 kilometers, extremely close in orbital terms. Then Kosmos 2543 did something even stranger. It released its own object, a small device or sub-satellite separated from Kosmos 2543 and moved independently. Now there were three objects: the original Kosmos 2542, the deployed Kosmos 2543, and this newest undesignated object, like Russian nesting dolls, each containing a smaller version. The U.S. Space Force tracked all three objects with concern. A satellite that can release smaller satellites, which can in turn release even smaller objects, has obvious military implications. These smaller objects could be inspection satellites, debris collectors, or weapons. Russia maintained that Kosmos 2542 and 2543 were testing on-orbit servicing technologies, the ability to inspect, repair, or deorbit satellites. But the fact that these capabilities were demonstrated near a U.S. military satellite suggested a more adversarial purpose. In 2020, the small object released by Kosmos 2543 conducted what appeared to be a high-speed weapons test, ejecting something at high velocity into space. This was interpreted by Western analysts as a demonstration of anti-satellite capability, showing that Russia could place a small weapons platform near an enemy satellite and fire at it or other targets. Russia denied this, saying the test was of space debris mitigation technology. But the pattern of behavior, approaching a U.S. satellite, releasing a smaller object, then conducting a high-velocity test, suggested more aggressive intent. The three objects remain in orbit, though their activities have become less visible. They continue to maneuver occasionally, but less dramatically than in 2019-2020. What makes the Kosmos 2542-253 system mysterious isn't just its capabilities. It's the question of how many similar systems might be in orbit undetected. If a satellite can hide smaller satellites inside it, and those can hide even smaller objects, how many of the tracked objects in orbit might actually contain hidden payloads? This incident revealed a new category of orbital object: satellites that aren't what they appear to be, that contain hidden capabilities, or sub-satellites that can be deployed when needed. T-90F, the object that fell. In October 2015, astronomers detected an object on a collision course with Earth. Designated WT-90F, it was predicted to impact in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka on November 13, 2015. This gave researchers a rare opportunity to observe and study an incoming object before impact. As astronomers tracked WT-90F, they realized it was highly unusual. Its orbit was extremely elliptical, taking it from near Earth out to twice the distance of the Moon. This orbit suggested it had been circling Earth-Moon space for a long time, possibly decades. More strange was its density. Calculations based on how sunlight and Earth's gravity affected its trajectory suggested WT-90F had very low density, much lower than rock or metal. It appeared to be hollow or made of lightweight materials. This strongly suggested WT-90F was artificial, a piece of space hardware rather than a natural object. But nobody knew what it was. Checks of all known rocket stages, satellites, and lunar mission debris showed nothing that matched WT-90F's orbit or characteristics. Some researchers suggested it might be a rocket stage from one of the Apollo missions that had been in Earth-Moon orbit for decades and was only recently detected. But the Apollo mission's hardware is extensively documented, and nothing from those missions matched. Others proposed it might be from a Chinese or Soviet lunar mission. Several missions from both nations had sent hardware to the Moon in the 1960s and 1970s, and records from that era aren't as complete as Apollo's. WT-1190F might be a forgotten piece of Cold War-era hardware. On November 13, 2015, WT-1190F re-entered Earth's atmosphere as predicted, breaking up over the Indian Ocean. Aircraft were positioned to observe the re-entry, and scientists collected data on how the object burned up. The re-entry confirmed that WT-1190F was artificial. Its breakup pattern was consistent with hollow manufactured materials, not solid rock, but its exact identity was never determined. What makes WT-1190F's case significant is what it revealed. There are artificial objects in high Earth orbit or Earth-Moon space that we don't have cataloged or identified. WT-1190F had been circling Earth for potentially decades without anyone knowing it was there. If one such object can go undetected for so long, how many others might be out there? High orbits in Earth-Moon space are less intensively monitored than low Earth orbit. Objects in these regions can go years without being detected by tracking systems. WT-1190F's origin remains officially unknown. It appears in reports as likely space debris of artificial origin from unknown mission. Somewhere, in some archive, there might be records of what mission it came from, but those records haven't been connected to WT-1190F, and the object has now been destroyed by re-entry, taking its secrets with it. The Soviet biosatellites. Between 1973 and 1996, the Soviet Union and later Russia launched a series of satellites called BION. Officially, these were biological research satellites, carrying experiments with plants, animals, and microorganisms to study the effects of spaceflight on living organisms. The BION program was relatively open. Missions were announced, payloads described, and results published. Many missions carried experiments from Western scientists through international cooperation. The program seemed transparent, but satellite trackers noticed something odd. Several objects designated as BION satellites had orbital characteristics inconsistent with biological research missions. They were in higher orbits than necessary, had unusual power consumption patterns, and occasionally maneuvered in ways that suggested capabilities beyond simple research satellites. More puzzling were radio emissions. Some BION satellites transmitted far more radio traffic than needed for a biological research mission. Analysis of the radio signals showed encrypted communications using military-grade protocols, not the open scientific data expected from research satellites. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, some details emerged. Reports from Russian space program insiders suggested that certain BION satellites had dual purposes. They carried biological experiments as advertised, but they also carried classified payloads, possibly surveillance equipment, signals intelligence systems, or other military technology. The biological research was real and provided useful scientific data, but it also provided cover for classified activities. Who would suspect a satellite carrying monkeys and plants of conducting military operations? This became more interesting in 1996 when the final BION mission, BION 11, suffered a malfunction. The recovery capsule, which was supposed to return to Earth with its biological specimens, failed to separate from the satellite. The entire satellite remained in orbit longer than planned. During this extended mission, BION 11 was observed conducting unusual maneuvers and transmitting encrypted signals to ground stations in Russia. The pattern of activity didn't match a malfunctioning biological research satellite. It looked like deliberate operations. Eventually, BION 11 re-entered and was destroyed, but the incident raised questions about all previous BION missions. Had they all carried dual-use payloads? Were the biological experiments the primary mission or the cover story? Complicating matters is that Russia has never fully declassified BION program details. Some mission data remains classified decades after the missions ended. For a supposedly civilian scientific program, this level of secrecy is unusual. What makes the BION satellites mysterious today is that we can't definitively say what all of them were doing. The biological research was real and documented, but there's strong evidence that some missions had classified secondary purposes that have never been officially acknowledged. This represents a troubling category of orbital object, satellites that are publicly acknowledged and described, but whose true capabilities or purposes are hidden behind a cover story. These 10 cases reveal a disturbing reality. Not everything orbiting Earth is accounted for. From the Black Knight satellite detected in 1960 to modern Chinese and Russian satellites demonstrating unprecedented capabilities, our orbital space contains objects whose origins, purposes, or true natures remain mysterious. Some of these objects, like J0022E3 and WT1 and ROF, appear to be forgotten space hardware whose records were lost or never properly documented. Others, like SJ17 USA 276 and Kosmos 2542-2543, are acknowledged satellites whose capabilities are deliberately kept secret. Still others, like the Black Knight and certain Bion satellites, occupy a gray area where their very existence or purpose is disputed. What unites these cases is that they challenge the assumption that space agencies know and track everything in orbit. The reality is more complex. Objects appear with no recorded launch. Satellites maneuver in unexpected ways. Hardware thought destroyed turns up decades later. And classified programs place objects in space whose purposes are deliberately obscured. Modern tracking can detect objects larger than 10 centimeters in low Earth orbit, but smaller objects, objects in higher orbits, and objects employing stealth techniques can evade detection. The Westford Needles showed how easily we can lose track of things we deliberately placed in space. WT9OF showed that objects in high orbits can circle Earth for decades undetected. The development of satellites that can approach, inspect, capture, or destroy other satellites, demonstrated by SJ17, USA 276, and the Kosmos system, adds another layer of mystery. These satellites can interact with each other in ways that aren't visible from ground tracking. We see them approach and separate, but we don't know what happens during those encounters. Perhaps most concerning is the nesting doll problem revealed by Kosmos 2542-2543. If satellites can contain hidden sub-satellites, then the catalog of known orbital objects might be dramatically incomplete. Every satellite could potentially be multiple objects. The uncomfortable truth is that Earth's orbital space is less transparent than we'd like to believe. Thousands of objects circle our planet, and while we track most of them, some remain mysterious, some are deliberately hidden, and new ones appear periodically with unclear origins. Whatever is up there, watching down on us, we don't fully know who put it there or what it's doing.